I'm really excited today to have Peter Drew, a symphonist, jazz composer, all around mensch on One Symphony today. Peter, I would love to start asking you about you have had many diverse careers and interests in your life. And I would just love to start where those took you and how those ended up in the musical realm.
Well, it's a long story. I was born in Europe, came to the United States as a kind of refugee. My mother remarried, lost my father, but remarried. I got a stepbrother, and he started me on a harmonica. I started to blow an ill wind in there. I said, "Whoa, this is an interesting sound," But then when I was, I don't know, about 11 years old or so, I was listening to the radio. My stepbrother had got me started on a classical music station in New York called WQXR. At one point, I was listening and I heard Toscanini, this was about 11, 12 years old, conduct the NBC Symphony Orchestra in a performance of Beethoven's Ninth. And I said, whoa, that was it. I really was hooked. I figured, Ode to Joy, dann die Freude, alle Menschen werden Brüder. I said, wow. And I started to blow that. That was the first tune that I really could do on the harmonica, which is a kind of a quantum leap because I didn't read music. It's just what I heard. And that's got me started early on.
That's a pretty advanced piece of music to be playing on the harmonica.
That is true. I didn't go very far from it, but I got hooked with Beethoven and I just loved listening to the classical music, especially classical composers. And Beethoven was my favorite. And afterwards, I went to high school, didn't do very well, but somebody said, hey, maybe he's interested in music. Get him into the music department, see if they can help him. As a matter of fact, I was interested in the oboe. Why? I don't know. I guess I like the sound of it. I asked the director there if he had any oboes. He said, no, but I got a bassoon. So I started on a bassoon, played in the orchestra, loved it. I wasn't very good, but I went to this Williamsburg settlement house, a place in Brooklyn. We didn't have much money, but I got lessons from a guy for $2 an hour. Try and get that nowadays for $2 an hour. And he eventually became a contrabassoonist for the Boston Symphony. He said, hey, look, I'm recommending a book. It's called Elementary Training for Musicians by
Mm.
Paul Smith. You probably don't know of that. That got me started. Later on, I couldn't afford a bassoon, so I bought myself a clarinet. Man, I started noodle around on that. And I still couldn't read music that well, but I was getting along and I got into it.
So, can you talk about being in the professional music world or being out of the professional music world? It sounds like you've come at it from a jazz angle, an arranger angle, a composer angle, and now more of a classical angle, but it seems like you started there. Talk about how that inner and outer worlds of classical music business interact.
Right. Well, it's kind of a long story. I will tell you this. I was not really classically music trained. I did so many other things. I worked in film distribution for a while. I was a caterer. I did a lot of things. I always had music in the back of my mind, always noodle around on a clarinet, things like that. I was in a lot of other fields. I taught film studies, for example, in high school and college. I was basically a social studies teacher for many years in a high school in New York City. I loved teaching. I really did. I had a good time with it and I felt it was easy. I was teaching in the military, as a matter of fact, but actually nothing to do with music. It just, I loved music. Eventually, I started to take it seriously by getting music teachers, basically clarinet. I studied with a lot of people who were playing with the big bands. I got involved with some jazz. I got involved with a group that used to play in an area in Queens. And a lot of people were mostly amateurs, some guys who were really very good at it. And I finally decided I can read music now. I can play music. I'm not bad at this. I like it. And let me see what I could do with as far as arranging. So I did that. And I did it generally on weekends, evenings. I studied with a guy who taught me about Sibelius and stuff like that. And so I got into it through a kind of back door after doing all the other things, including catering and a lot of other stuff, taking people around New York on tours. As I said, I always loved it. I love jazz. I like different forms of music. I listened to a lot of stuff. I loved listening to the great composers who also wrote film scores. I just a melange of things. When I started writing, let's say, a symphony, all of these things gel together. I had a lot of stuff in my head, a lot of disorganized things, but basically from the American Songbook to Karl Orff to Villa Lobos to Beethoven to Brahms to Artie Shaw, all those things, including songs of the Auvergne and Tuvan throat singing and Raga, Mississippi Delta Blues, Lead Belly, Howlin' Wolf. And people say, wow, you're really confused. I did do a couple of CDs, which you can check out on the internet, Peter Drew Music. So finally, I grew up and I said, gee, I think this is what I want to really do. I think I'm better at composition than I am at performing, and I can write music.
Most
And
composers, right?
well, yeah, yeah. My also problem was I've always had a handicap in my hand. One of my fingers has no tendon in it. So I'm in the midst of writing a piano concerto, but so
Wow.
this thing is, do you play the piano? No, I have enough pocket. I did. But you know what I'll do? I'll blow some notes on my clarinet. I'll say, hey, okay, let me transfer this to Sibelius and see how I can do with that. With IT, I need help with that. When brains were passed for IT, I wasn't there. So any technical stuff, that's not my forte.
So, in terms of how you are incorporating all these different elements into your music, Gustav Mahler said a symphony should contain everything, the entire universe. This symphony of yours, Reminiscence, I think that could have been said by you as well. Can you talk about how you, instead of taking, say, I'm going to use three of these elements and do one symphony, then I'm going to take three more into the second symphony? What made you decide to take all of these kind of elements? It's almost like you're the Apollo mission sending this record out into space. Can you talk about how you incorporated all those elements into just one symphony? And what is the technical process behind this? Because everybody's lived their entire life and they have their experiences, but how do you specifically translate that into music or a thematic symphony?
Well, the first thing is what it sounds like. If I hear something and I like the melody, I like the tune, and it sticks with me. So, for example, if I talk about songs of the Auvergne, I find that lilting, that beautiful melody. And I figured, can I incorporate that into something? I don't want to steal it outright, but certainly there are phrases in there that I can use. Certainly, Tuvan throat singing or raga, I can do that. And just making sure that I tie the right notes together, that one phrase flows into another, which is really what it's all about. In other words, where there's really no dissonance, but I'm still stuck in this kind of romantic classical era of music. In other words, how I go about it is just something as I work with a phrase and I like it, and I will just work on that phrase and capitalize on what I've already done into different movements. So, for example, if I start off, let's say, with a strident first movement, my second movement might be a little calm and lilting and have stuff that could be described as more lyrical. In other words, something that's contrapuntal to what I did before.
And in terms of the orchestration, you said you could play melodies on your clarinet, or you might,
Yeah.
how you're coming up with the melodies, how are you translating to the harmonies? And obviously, your arrangements, especially for jazz, is very clear throughout, and your love for film music and Bernard Herrmann and composers like that is very clear as well. How are you expanding the forms from these smaller germs?
Well, for example, if I start, let's say, with a phrase on my clarinet, something that's very catchy, and I'll say, okay, I'll put this down for first clarinet, then second clarinet. I will use another phrase similar to it to complement what an instrument sounds like. And then I would gradually add other instruments to find out the best mix for that, to see if they comes together properly. I want to really please the ear of the listener as well as myself. For me, it's very important to have something that sounds good. Somebody once said, well, let me hear what it sounds like, and I'll tell you if I like it, if it fits in with that. So, in other words, if I say, okay, I'm writing and I have, let's say, 40 different instruments, using a lot of instrumentation for a large symphony, I want to make sure that all of these pieces fit together in such a way that it complements what went before.
I'm really excited because Boulder Symphony is recording Reminiscence very soon here. And I'm just curious in terms of people who maybe don't know some of the various styles that you're inspired by, or somebody who might not think they really understand the language of a symphony or a symphonic work. Some pop pieces and some classical pieces speak to people directly right away. You remember, you can sing the tune and you're drawn to it for some unknown reason. What is the latch on Reminiscence for somebody who might not be a symphonic classical music listener or maybe have experienced some of the cultural nods that you've thrown in there?
Without being a snob, I don't expect people to know Ray Vaughan Williams or Aaron Copland. What I am looking for really when I do this is the same thing that inspired me. Something sounds good. It feels good. And therefore, it's good to listen to. And so I don't expect people to know everything about Beethoven or everything about songs of the Auvergne or stuff like that. But if I put it in and somebody says, you know what, I like that tune. And I heard that tune, for example, a phrase, let's say, from either Copland or Gershwin, essentially American music. Well, hey, you got the American songbook. Well, a lot of people, especially older people like me, cut their teeth on people like Gershwin and Cole Porter and all of those big names that are associated with the American songbook. If they hear something and they say, oh, you know something, I can relate to that because the phrasing and the tempi and the things that go along with it, it's easy on the ears. It might be easy to sing. There are certain very modern composers that I have trouble relating with. It doesn't mean that their music is not good, but for example, if you ask them to hum along with it or to listen to it, it might be a little difficult. In other words, let's say, for example, if you're brought up on atonal music, then lyrical music will sound atonal. Your ear won't be used to it. So what I'm doing is I'm just basing what I write based on my own upbringing as far as music goes. And I'm really writing for a lot of people out there. It's not only for myself. It's like, hey, you know, I think they're going to like this.
Mhm. A lot of the great composers start very early and they do most of their work very early. Many are dying quite young. You took such a long time to get to this symphony. Can you talk about how waiting so long and experiencing all of these other aspects of life, maybe even non musical in different career paths, how did that inform your symphonic writing? Because this is your first basically major classical work, correct?
It is correct. Yes. I did smaller jazz pieces, a number of CDs, as a matter of fact, but I always wanted to write a symphony. When I was very young, when I listened to Beethoven, I waved my arms around. And I think I'm conducting. I don't know the first thing about conducting, to be honest, but I know what I want to hear. I went through a lot of phases in my life. I went through a tremendous amount of jobs. And the thing is, when you think about it, this late in my life, and I'm talking late because I'm going to be 90 in November. And that's a hell of a long time. So I've come through a lot of lifetimes. When I wrote my autobiography, I went through a lot of stuff. And the thing is, all of that impinged on my writing, not only my linear stuff, for example, writing a book or something like that, but on my music as well. I came in contact with a lot of people, not only in teaching on high school and college level, military level, I taught that as well. All of these things gelled in me, and all the time listening to the voices, the language of past composers, notes and phrases which speak to me. I can't tell you that, gee, I was a caterer, so catering music affected me in some way, but it's a melange, it's a stew of music. I'm just saying that just living and having done so many things over all these years, from that first notes that I blew into this cheap harmonica, it just affected me in a way that I can hear a phrase or hear music and I'll hurry home and I'll say, I got to take that phrase and do something with it. I'm sure that you know exactly what I'm referring to. Many musicians do. And this is where it went. I don't know if that solves or answers what you want, but
No, the purpose of my question is to create more questions. So,
oh, please fire away.
can
Right.
you talk about how your surroundings influenced those? Was it different from how you had to create the symphony? And was one easier or did one come more naturally to you?
Well, let's put it this way. If I'm arranging for 3 or 4 instruments, like a jazz combo, that's a lot simpler than arranging for a symphony. I had to get a lot of help. In other words, I had an orchestrator. Hey, I like the sound of this, but I can't put all these instruments together. Yeah, I know what I would like the sound. You write down, make the instrumentation. Let me listen to it and I'll tell you if that's what I want. So basically, for me, writing, being with a group where they played in unison, I said, hey, this is boring. So let's just, and all I did was carry that stuff over, but I needed help when I'm talking about 40 or 30 different instruments in order to get the sound that I was looking for. By the way, there are elements you will know there are elements of Gershwin, there are elements of certainly Aaron Copland. All those elements come together in a number of my compositions. I'm influenced by Mahler. I'm influenced by a ton of people. So just a question of bringing those instruments and those sounds together.
And once the symphony is created, it's orchestrated. Can you talk about the next process? Because I think, especially for composers who haven't had their music recorded or younger composers, because obviously we all want people to hear our music.
Right.
Can you talk about for you how you went to the next level? I know you got it recorded in Europe. You have performances coming up in America. Can you,
You
can you
know,
talk about that next step and how that happens?
well, the thing is that once computers came in, and all of a sudden I could put stuff down. Somebody helped me with Sibelius. I'm talking about the app that you can transcribe, transpose, and things like that with just a touch of the finger. Well, I found it. Wow, this is fabulous. I could do is just sit by a computer and put notes down and then listen to them and then add or take away from them and change the key or whatever. That to me was a quantum leap. So where did it go from there? Well, when I started playing with a group, a small ensemble, which gradually got bigger into what the big band sound. And then afterwards I found out, well, I was studying with this guy who happened to be a bass player, and I recorded something on Sibelius. And he said to me, Peter, get real musicians to play your stuff. Why are you bothering with the sounds of Sibelius? Get real. So I did. I hired musicians. So you said a New York sound? Yeah. I hired a group of studio musicians. Some were pit musicians, and they got my music. They liked it. And those were mostly arrangements, but I also did original compositions, a few. And so then afterwards, I said, you know what? I have got to do something that I always wanted to do, and that's to do a symphony. So now I got a producer who worked with me on it and who got connections and helped me. In fact, he also got an orchestrator for me. And then the next thing I know, he said, we can hook you up with an organization that can get your music distributed. And so what was the next step? Well, the next step, he said, well, we have an orchestra in Zagreb in Croatia who likes your work and is willing to record it. Yeah, it involves money. And I know I have to pay the musicians, you know. And the thing is, that's what happened next. So it was recorded. By the way, the CDs were also recorded and made a jazz list for being very good and very interesting. And I was very happy. I was really happy. For me, it wasn't a question of making money, because if it was a question of making money, I'd be on the corner cadging quarters. Point of fact is, it was just pure enjoyment. I loved doing it. I found my niche.
We have a unique situation of a composer and a conductor, and the conductor is about to perform and record video and audio, not just a sound recording. Talk about what are the things that you're thinking about? What challenges do you anticipate, and how do you conceive of the final product?
Okay, I'm sure you're aware that I changed the ending because I thought people are going to go to sleep with this one at the end.
And it ends on the performance, it ends the first half. So we want them going into buying drinks and donating to the orchestra and all.
No, exactly, exactly. Here's what I would tell people: enjoy yourself. I don't want people to suffer with, oh God. First of all, I think my music is not that difficult to perform. I would tell people, enjoy it, have fun. Hey, I don't want you to suffer with this. This is not what it's about. I know because I can't conduct, but listen, I've been sitting on as an orchestra member. So I know what people go through, and I just want to have a good time. Enjoy yourself. This is not something that's insurmountable. I'm not a control freak. It's okay. It's all right to make mistakes. Don't make mistakes during the performance, but while you're working on it, have fun. That's really what it's about. What do I expect? I expect to hear some good stuff. It's not like you guys are an amateur orchestra. I've listened to some of your stuff that you have. I love it. You're very professional. So to me, enjoy yourselves. Have a good time.
I assume you speak on behalf of all composers.
I don't know about that. Some people are real bust your cojones. But the point is that, first of all, to be very honest, I am not a good performer. I like the fact that I can write things down and get people say, hey, this is good stuff. I'd like to play it. And I'm good. I'm home that way. I feel good that finally, at this point in my life, I've gotten to something where I can say it's an accomplishment. For all of my life, I've been in so many fields, and it's like jack of all, master of none. I figure one day I'll grow up and I'll know what I really want to do. Huh. But now at this point in my life, I could say, this is great. This is where I want to be. If people enjoy it, if they enjoy listening to it, and if people enjoy playing it, well, then I've accomplished something.
If you had to pick a favorite movement of Reminiscence, what would it be and
Third,
why? Third movement.
yeah,
That's mine too.
I like that because it comes together. It's got energy. And I kind of like that energy. I like the Bach to Bach, but all of the things to come together, I like it. Maybe it's the German in me. But I favor that move. You're asking me, it's almost like, which eye do you prefer, your left or your right? But
Yeah.
I like the symphony, but if I had to pick, okay, yeah, third.
And you talked about Beethoven's Ninth with Toscanini was the first thing you heard, and probably most people liken all symphonic works to Beethoven. And Beethoven had this really strong idea that you had to create some kind because there was this drama and there were these unresolved societal, and it needed to be overcome at the
Right.
end. How does your symphony move away from that or incorporate any of those elements from when you were a kid and listening to Beethoven?
Well, you have to reiterate, although I love Beethoven, but I have other influences that come in there. If you hear all of a sudden, you might hear an echo, a couple of bars of the fifth of Beethoven or something that sounds similar to. You also hear some Gershwin in there. You'll hear something that contrapuntal that sounds not like I'm lifting things right out of Beethoven, but drawing influence. You know my piece now, I'm sure. And the thing is, you also know all the influences because they're right there. They're on the page. So when I say back to Bach, okay, yeah, there's Bach in there. There's Mussorgsky in there. I happen to like Mussorgsky. By the way, when I was a kid, I listened to a program in New York. It was called Escape. And the theme music was Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain. So I loved that. I said, well, this is great. I'm not sure if it answers the question you asked. I'm not trying to be evasive, but just tell you that, yeah, while I love Beethoven, I also love a lot of other composers, but Beethoven was, you might say, my guru, the first thing that really struck me to do something with music.
Well, Peter, it's been great talking to you. I'm looking forward to meeting you in person. And for anybody listening, if you are in the Boulder, Colorado area, March 29th and 30th, we're going to be performing Peter Drew Symphony Reminiscence, along with some other works by some little known folks like Beethoven, Rossini, and Puccini. Peter's going to be there in person and looking forward to this performance, Peter. And thanks for being on One Symphony.
Thank you, Maestro, for the time you took. I hope I clarified things and didn't muddy the field. And as I said initially, just enjoy. I'm having a good time doing this. It's nice meeting you. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Peter.